when you don't know how these things are intertwined, that's when you get on a Reddit thread like this and you're a racist piece of shit. And you're like, there's so many Indians coming to our country and they're the reason that we have no housing. Like, that's how in Australia you end up with bigoted views towards migrants. And it's a problem. So, you may wonder, why is Pixel talking about immigration? Honestly, I was scrolling through Reddit and I came across this. Homeless crisis sweeps Australia. Meanwhile, wasn't it 500,000 people allowed to immigrate here last year? Which links to this article. Keep in mind, it's macro business. Last year, National Shelter reported that the number of people experiencing homelessness increased by 50% between 2020 and 2022. The number of people living in improvised homes and rough sleeping also increased by 103% over the same period. Incredible graphic. The situation worsened in 2023 following the collapse in the nation's rental vacancy rate and soaring rental inflation. True, we have a housing crisis. This is for sure. Homelessness advocates around Australia reported that in 2023 was the hardest year on record, with many being forced to turn people away owing to a lack of resources. According to a recent Homelessness Australia survey of 252 workers across frontline and support functions, service providers observed a massive increase in demand for assistance in 2023 amid the worsening housing and cost of living crisis across the country. 93% of those surveyed claimed the housing problem had worsened in the last year, while 35% had to turn away people seeking help. Homelessness providers are expected to work miracles, but the strain is simply unrelenting. Funding, which is already uncertain, is plateauing while demand surges. It is difficult to see how the housing situation will improve in 2024 given Australia's population is expected to continue growing at a historically high rate at the same time as actual dwelling construction continues to fall. I mean, this looks ridiculous because of the pandemic, right? Like this graph looks like ridiculous because of the pandemic. Let me just see if this is relevant. The inevitable result will be ongoing rental stress, with more Australians being forced to live in share housing or becoming homeless. It is an inequality disaster in the making, exacerbated by the Albanese government's mass immigration policy. Okay. Oh. Lemo. That is the end of the article. That's just it. Chat, this is where people are getting their news from. That's the end. That's the end. Fuck Albanese. I mean, look, I am very critical of some Albanese policy, but okie dokie. Well, should we just have a little look-see at the comments? What going to happen to these beggars when we go cashless? Oof. Time for Nationalism 101. This is Beude, the revolutionary tipping points past anti-worker events, both economic and repressive. When we see the brutal suppression of the unfed, unhoused, and unemployed homelessness destroying potential, as this gets worse, an Indian elbow is the Oz distributor of it. What the fuck am I reading? Lives will be lost to live rounds. Then people will begin to wake up. Not because they care about the deaths of a few women and children or the destruction of families, but because they see themselves as next. Think this can't happen? I suggest researching the NZ street riots in Wellington, Auckland, and Dunedin. Special farmers' sons armed with pistols on horseback, shooting people sitting on their steps. He added a link too. An opinion piece from New Zealand. Worth noting how TPTB insists that Canadian truckers followed by large-scale protests in New Zealand and Australia in early 22 had nothing to do with all the subsequent dismantling of the vaccine mandates. They all read those documents saying 1% of the population who feel strongly can easily change the government. I'm not sure how 1% of the population could change Indian elbows jihad against existing Australians. Is this Real? Some years ago, I sent an email to everybody home saying that the solution was no or low immigration. The idea was dismissed and they supported immigration. That's the article that was linked on this Reddit thread. And what, to bring this back to where I'm going, I'm providing context for a wider conversation because the comments get progressively worse. The third infographic shows we're building about the same number of homes currently compared to 1995. It is true, we are not building enough housing. Not only are we not building enough housing, but we have this huge problem with infrastructure. You can build houses, but without infrastructure, jobs, schools, hospitals, nobody wants to live there. Nobody wants to commute 2 hours to the city so that they can afford a house anymore because it's too difficult. So in 28 years, we haven't increased home building. The population of Australia was 18 million then. Today it is 26.9 million. I suspect that may be part of the problem. We don't make stuff anymore and have become too lazy to plan. Migration has been used as a solution to the failure to plan and has not been used to increase nation building or productivity. The solution is neither increasing or decreasing migration, but to have some sort of strategy to solving the problems of this country. Basically, to have a sensible plan about getting from where we are now to where we want to be in the future. Okay. This comment is actually one of the good comments in that it is correct. This is where countries with the ability for long-term planning thrive a little harder than countries with a 3/4 year election cycle, because each subsequent government undoes the policy or wants opposite policy to the current one. I honestly think it's one of the reasons, perhaps, that the Labor government is keeping the stage 3 tax cuts at the moment, because it's just so ridiculous to keep flipping it back and forth, even though I think abolishing them could be a thing. It's, addressing bracket creep or whatever. Sometimes it's better to have some semblance of long-term strategy. Housing is definitely one of those areas where long-term strategy is a huge part of it, and it's not good, right? In the previous election cycle before the most recent one, Labor campaigned on a reduction of negative gearing and or getting rid of negative gearing. And that would have been incredible. And yet we didn't do it then. And I think it is going to be seen as one of the major failures of Australian policy, because in Australia, our housing market is very closely tied to our retirement funds. Therefore, people's wealth is very tied up in the property market here. But the property market here is now so ridiculously inaccessible to people. That is why there is a housing crisis, because there are so many apartments, but nobody can afford to live in them. Then you're seeing families have to move out to the country when all of the job opportunities are in the city. And then you've got boomers living in the city who are just in retirement and then have enough capital to buy another house or another apartment and increase their property portfolio. The wealth disparity that is leading to the housing crisis is one of the big things. If you scroll down this thread, it's just why are there so many this race? Why I'm not going to go through it all. It's almost as if, now bear with me, that governments of both persuasions use mass immigration to hold up the housing market and drive down wages and conditions in this country. I think that is not the case. I do think that you can have a conversation about foreign investment and stuff like that, but the reason that we're participating in bigger than usual immigration at the moment is because we have a worker shortage, a huge one. You saw what happened on the fruit and vegetable farms because we didn't have backpackers during the pandemic. We had no workers because usually it's just exploited backpackers. Literally terrible. And that's still very dodgy, but a part of the immigration scheme here. But it's more to do with aged care. We have an aging population. On 9th of May 2023, the Australian government announced that the planning level for 2023-24 permanent migration program will be set at 190,000 places. The government has designed the 2023-24 permanent migration program to address persistent and emerging skill shortages and to attract people with specialist skill sets that are difficult to find or develop in Australia. While Australia is building the domestic pipeline of highly skilled workers, the permanent migration program will help build resilience, boost productivity, and support our economy as it transitions to net zero emissions. You don't have a shortage of workers, you have an overabundance of shitty businesses. Yeah, but it's also just wealth disparity. Like, it's capitalism in a fucking nutshell. Recognizes the strong contribution of all migrants to social cohesion. It focuses on strengthening family and community bonds in Australia and also demonstrates the government's commitment to family reunification. What do they mean by that? Does anybody fucking know? What do they mean by that? Reunification refers to when a worker comes to Oz leaving their family behind. Right. Okay. So the policy is attempting to get family members over here. So say if somebody came over from the Philippines to work in Australia, it's also the policy is working to bring over more members of their family. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. The permanent migration program will help address the challenges of an aging population. Migration reduces the average age of the population and slows the rate of population aging. This is because migrants are, on average, younger than the existing Australian population. And after 9 years of Liberal policy, there ain't many women having fucking children. Like, our birth rate, while not as low as places like South Korea, is not good. Like, it's too difficult for people to have children. It's too expensive. The access to childcare was non-existent. So to explain this, Australia has a ridiculously aging population. We are going to have so many boomers in aged care when millennials need aged care. And we already have a staff shortage. So many aged care facilities closed after the pandemic. The pandemic really shone a light on how bad our aged care system was. We had the Royal Commission into aged care, right? It's bad. But what the Royal Commission into aged care showed is that the setup that we have for aged care here is not sustainable. Not even slightly. We do not have enough money. We do not have enough workers. Some of the workers even now are on casual contracts going from facility to facility. That's still the way it works. And it needs a full overhaul. But the reason they're getting so many workers in is because we are going to require care workers to a significant amount, and teachers and doctors and nurses. I don't know if you guys saw this week, but university enrollment rates are at record lows, which is why I think they've opened up. Where was the thing I showed before? This one. Which is why these things, these visas have opened up as well, because university enrollments are so low. Because universities at the moment are so privatized. Now the boomers are about entering aged care, it's become a problem for them. It's a problem for all of us. There's not going to be anybody to look after them. And it's more millennials. Boomers are still going to be in aged care by the time millennials need aged care. Once you internalize demographics, everything becomes clear. I don't think people realize just how bad our aging population is. Maybe we should pay care workers more, not import cheaper labor. I mean, Scotland, absolutely, we should pay care workers more. We should make their conditions so much better. It's one of the major things that we have to do. But like, this sort of infrastructure needs to be developed now. We're almost too late now. What is happening is because we have immigration coming in to try and address these future issues right now, it's only exacerbating the already existent housing crisis, which has been years of failing housing policy. Negative gearing, wealth disparity, like rental payments at the moment. My rent's about to go up $100 a fucking week. Just to give, and I'm telling you guys that to give you an idea of how bad the cost of living crisis is here. A week. we are looking at an extra $400 a month. So when people say there is a housing crisis in Australia, there is a housing crisis. Remember when I was covering the ex-RBA guy and he was talking about how where they were increasing interest rates because they needed to have people hurting more and we needed more people living in dwellings. He wanted more people to be living in a house because that opens up more housing, technically, right? And they only have one tiny little lever to pull, which is interest rates, which has not been good. How good are rental protections for renters in Australia? Well, probity, there are some, but it's not great. We are very much in Australia. You save to buy a property. You own property. Everybody knows the way you build wealth is by buying a house. It is almost a cultural thing here because most people's retirement funds are tied up in the housing market as well. So superannuation, that is our retirement funds that are paid out by employers here, are very closely intertwined with the property market here in Australia. So everybody has a vested interest in the property market continuing to grow, and it's unsustainable. It is entirely unsustainable. And the wealth gap at the moment between owners and those who are renting is huge. There are so many people who will never even have the opportunity to enter the housing market because they're up against people who can just drop huge cash lump sums on purchasing property. If you have to renew your rent contract every single year and could, in the worst case, be forced to move apartments every year, there are no protections to speak of. I mean, yes, normally you can only get 1 year rental contracts here in Australia. And in Victoria specifically, because I looked this up recently, there is no limit to how much they can increase your rent. They do have to show calculations of how they increased your rent, but there is no limit. The way I've calculated my rent is by looking at apartments around me that are being rented at the moment. And the reality is they're all $100 more a week. So we'll see what happens. Maybe my landlords will be kind to me, but who knows? They were thinking about selling. I don't know what's going to happen. I might have to move. To bring it back to the point, the mass immigration that is happening is only exacerbating the housing crisis. So the people that are like questioning and not understanding why all these immigrants are coming in and then being like, look, they're just bringing them in for fucking no reason and I'm so annoyed because that's the reason for the housing crisis. No, poor government policy, and it's not necessarily Albanese's policy, by the fucking way, is the reason that we have the housing crisis that we do now. But it's also the way that our society is set up. It is neoliberal policy and negative gearing that has resulted in this situation. Negative gearing in Australia deals with the laws in the Australian income tax system relating to net loss suffered by a taxpayer on their investment property, commonly called negative gearing. Negative gearing can arise in a number of contexts. For example, with real estate investment, it arises when the net rental income is less than the mortgage loan interest payable, and with shares when net divided income is less than the interest payable on a margin loan. So basically what can happen is you can claim a loss and it's valuable in a tax setting. For income tax purposes, Australia allows the offsetting of property losses against other types of income, right? So if you lose on an investment property, you can, say you lose like 60K, you can offset that off your wage or business income so that you have to pay way less tax. So it makes it valuable to even keep properties that you are making a loss on. Negative gearing by property investors reduced personal income tax revenue in Australia by 600 million. We're at third. Oh, wait. 600 million in 2001. 3.9 billion in 2004 and 05, and 13.2 billion in 2010, 2011. Holy shit. Keeping in mind, Labor went to the election just after this one with the abolishing negative gearing that nobody wanted and they didn't get through. Negative gearing continues to be a controversial political issue in Australia and was a major issue during the 2016 and 2019 Australian federal elections, during which the Australian Labor Party proposed restricting but not eliminating negative gearing and to halve the capital gains tax discount to 25%. An analysis found that negative gearing in Australia provides a greater benefit to wealthier Australians than less wealthy, according to a report from the Grattan Institute. Shocking. Federal Treasurer at the time, Scott Morrison. Oh, God, man. In defense of negative gearing, cited tax data that showed that numerous middle-income groups, teachers, nurses, and electricians, benefit in larger numbers from negative gearing than finance managers. Oh, yeah? I would like to have a pick through that data. I really would. I would really like to have a pick through that data. Yeah, the old Pentecostal Christian, Scott Morrison, is literally hoping for the rapture. Remember when he said he was an eagle coming down to lead Australia through the rapture or the darkness or something? He did. He said that. Or something along those lines. But that data seems sus. Traditionally, Australian taxpayers have been allowed to negatively gear their investment properties, in the strict sense of investing in property at an initial loss. In 1983, the Victorian Deputy Commissioner of Taxation briefly denied Victorian property investors the deduction for interest in excess of the rental income, so losses could not be transferred nor moved to a future tax year. That ruling was quickly overruled by the Federal Tax Commissioner. Dear old Victoria, trying to be communist again. Sorry, I'm joking. That's a joke. If you're not highly involved in Australian politics, you will not understand why that's funny. The Hawke's government threw a reversion to the earlier system in which property losses could not offset income from labour was unpopular with property investors. These investors claimed this reversion had caused investment in rental accommodation to dry up and rents to rise substantially. Well, rents are rising substantially now because there's nowhere to fucking live. This was unsupported by evidence other than localised increases in real rents in both Perth and Sydney, which also had the lowest vacancy rates of all capital cities at the time. In 2003, the Reserve Bank of Australia stated in its submission to the Productivity Commission First Home Ownership Inquiry, there are no specific aspects of current tax arrangements designed to encourage investment in property relative to other investments in the Australian tax system, nor is there any recent tax policy initiative we can point to that accounts for rapid growth in geared property investments. But the fact is that when we observe the results, resources and finance are being disproportionately channeled into this area, and property promoters use tax effectiveness as an important selling point. It's because it's used to increase wealth disparity. This is one of the ways that the rich have just gotten richer. And it's a reason that it will be so unpopular to get rid of, because again, in Australia, it is basically like Australian culture to save and want to buy a house and get into the property market, which historically, not necessarily a bad thing, probably historically encouraged to create social cohesion. Because if everybody is invested in holding up a system, in holding up society that functions a certain way, it creates a cohesive society, right? But the problem is there are so many loopholes now. There are so many foreign investors. There are so many, the wealth disparity is too large now that it's not functioning in any sort of effective way. Landlords weren't willing to take the hit. Yeah, because fuck the poor. I don't know if you've realized, but a lot of neoliberal policy is legitimately just like, fuck the poor. When studies show over and over again that a housing first approach to homelessness is a good one. But we have big problems. We need public housing. We need social housing. We need to restrict negative gearing. We need to address what goes on with Airbnbs, vacant properties. It's not immigration that is the cause of the housing crisis. Is it exacerbating a housing crisis? Perhaps. But it does, this Reddit thread just made me so fucking sad because it's so racist. I'm so glad to be a part of this sub where this shit can actually be discussed without some fuckwit with an agenda banning you. Common sense, mathematics, supply and demand seemingly don't exist for most people nowadays. It's idiotic. I thought all immigrants were uneducated, poor, and rotting the system. Very hard to see which bigoted view is the true one sometimes. Lol. Are immigrants to blame, or is it the severe lack of social housing? I mean, see, but this is incorrect, right? Because unless we have the immigrants come to our country now and start building up a workforce to deal with our aging population, we are going to have huge problems. Private supply doesn't mean shit when property developers can land bank and can charge whatever they like. Need massive amounts of public housing. I completely agree. Never mind the capital gains tax concession on investments as well. 50% off if you hold it for more than 12 months. Yep. Like, you guys can see. So the answer to this question is, one, you need better housing policy. Now, housing policy is complicated because it runs at the state level. So it's different everywhere. And we have this suburbanization problem in which there are very specific problems in different communities. Like, there are a lot of houses going up, even though in Australia we had a lot of construction businesses go under during the pandemic. But there are a lot of houses going up, but they are poor quality and the infrastructure around those houses is non-existent. Schools, hospitals, supermarkets, that sort of thing. Buses, public transport, food, convenience. It doesn't exist. So people don't want to live out there. And then that only exacerbates the issues that we have with the density of population in the cities. Dutton says boomers are stopping housing development at a local council level because it'll devalue their existing property. And he says it like it's not evil. So I believe him. I mean, people have been saying that there is an Australian housing bubble for like 10 years, longer. Everybody is well and truly invested in it not popping. It can't go on forever though. The wealth disparity is too big. People are already feeling it now. When you don't know how these things are intertwined, that's when you get on a Reddit thread like this and you're a racist piece of shit. And you're like, there's so many Indians coming to our country and they're the reason that we have no housing. Like, that's how in Australia you end up with bigoted views towards migrants. And it's a problem. And it's scary because you hear it. Like, Australia is a very multicultural place, and social cohesion and not blaming minorities or migrants or, you know, anybody, but like wealth disparity, billionaires and the government for your problems. Like, it's just so. So building another house would be bad just because I have two already. How many houses do you need? Housing is a commodity, but it shouldn't be. Do you not understand how fucked up it is that we think about housing as a commodity? I think I might profit today off people needing somewhere to live. These people look like they need to survive. That's an opportunity for money. When you put it like that, do you go, yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I like that. That sounds moral. Sexy. I'm into it. Surprisingly, the Tory UK government is about to introduce changes to the rental market there. No more fixed term contracts, no more no-fault evictions, and landlords must meet minimum standards enforced by councils. Oh, it sounds like the bare minimum, but cool. Seawall, very much so. But this, and I feel like every conversation we have leads back to this. It's wealth disparity. It's capitalism. It's continuous growth. We're not looking at anything in a sustainable way. The way we look at everything is based on continuous growth, which results in wealth disparity. This is why when people sit here critiquing all of these things, it leads back to the underlying assumption that there is only one way to survive, and that is if you continue to grow. If you're not growing, you're doing the opposite. If you're not getting that quarterly dividend, just profit. You got to keep those stakeholders happy every single quarter. If they're not happy every single quarter, you're a failure. I guess my point is that if the base problem is there needs to be more houses. Oh, Ted Doodle, I was talking about my utopia. But yeah, there needs to be more houses. But the problem is there needs to be more houses that are not owned by one single like developer. And by like, there are some people out there who own like hundreds, thousands of properties as a business. When people talk about homelessness, they talk about drugs, mental illness, everything except obvious relationship between property values and homelessness. You're all closer to being homeless than you are to being rich. For real. Wouldn't hurt for regulators to step up their game too. So many cowboy developers cutting corners on apartment blocks. Oh yeah. Zombie. And that is so true, right? Most people don't actually understand what homelessness looks like. Well, the thing is, Just Wolf, and this is why nothing ever happens, is because the decisions are unpopular to a voting public. Australians, as I've been mentioning, are so like sociologically trained to want to get into the property market that they're like, what? You're going to fuck up the property market just as I'm about to get into it? No. So for a voting public, like people going to the polls with like policy to say, reduce negative gearing is just not popular. That government will not get into office. And there you go. Then we just have housing problems over and over again. The problem isn't even consistent profits, which is insane. They have convinced the working class of accepting wage theft. Completely agree. Normalized wage theft is insane. It's like the CEOs that get huge bonuses when their companies do well while they're laying off workers, like happened this year. The mass layoffs in so many industries this year while these companies recorded record profits. Interesting. But not wage theft. Absolutely not. So many people are trying to win at capitalism. No one wants to uninstall the game they think they're about to win after the sunk cost of grinding hours they've put in. That's a really good metaphor. Just chat, you now know more about the relationship between the housing crisis and immigration policy in Australia than most Australians. Keeping in mind, like, if an Australian read this article, they're doing better than most. And remember, this article ended with, it is an inequality disaster in the making exacerbated by the Albanese government's mass immigration policy. It's bad. That end. Now, Australia is not known for particularly good immigration policy, unless your definition of good is stopping the boats and putting people on islands and in detention centres. Like, historically, Australia, pretty bad on immigration policy. What's the alternative? I mean, this is the thing. I am no policy expert. We have to have steady immigration. People just aren't having enough babies here. The Albanese government has increased access to childcare. That will help a little bit. We have more issues than that. People are working too much. Women do not have the opportunity or the safety to be able to be stay-at-home mums. They just don't, because it's too much of a risk of personal safety. Men do not have access to enough material wealth to support them. So women look at it, they're like, am I going to have a baby and work a full-time job and do half the work at home? In an ideal situation, more likely more than half the work at home. Women just aren't making that decision as much. And so without steady immigration, our aging population is going to be faced with some very, very serious problems.